Alan, la siguiente pregunta es sobre los paneles 4 y 6 de la exposición. El panel 4 muestra casas de estilo Tudor consolidadas alrededor del siglo XVI, donde la organización de la casa pasó a centrarse en el hall intermedio. Este espacio crea un sistema e interactúa con un repertorio de elementos como el porche, el corredor, el screen passage, el hall, el dais y el balcón de los músicos. El panel 6 incluye casas del hall intermedio del siglo XIX del Tudor Revival revisado. Este panel afirma que aquellas casas recuperaron el hall como núcleo doméstico protagonista y en torno a él se concentra la experiencia espacial de la casa. Alan, ¿qué opinas sobre la relación entre estos paneles 4 y 6 y las declaraciones que hacemos en ellos? Tienes la palabra, Alan.
Well, thank you. It raises so many interesting and complex questions, quite apart from where the hall is and what the hall does, which are questions about historical awareness and revival in many cases. But I think what I want to ask myself is, who are the people? What are their lives? How do they expect to use these spaces? How are the architects, when architects are involved, playing with these pieces, these elements, as they evidently do?
Alan, mi intervención es sobre la relación que establecemos en la pregunta anterior entre los paneles 4 y 6 de la exposición. En estos paneles presentamos un proceso de la formación de la casa del siglo XVI del estilo Tudor, donde la organización de la casa se centra en el hall intermedio y la casa del siglo XIX del Tudor Revival revisado, que recupera el hall como el espacio principal de su núcleo doméstico. En esta relación entre estas dos casas, primero enfatizamos en la casa del siglo XVI el sistema creado alrededor del hall en interacción con un repertorio de elementos, como decíamos, el porche, el corredor, el screen passage, el dais y el balcón de los músicos. Y segundo, presentamos cómo este repertorio de elementos fue interpretado más tarde por la casa del siglo XIX. Las imágenes ilustran estos dos momentos a los que me refiero, como en la primera parte del siglo XVI aparecen este repertorio de elementos y después verán ustedes en los ejemplos del siglo XIX cómo fueron interpretados. Con esto termino para dar paso a la intervención de la profesora Patricia.
End of the 15th century, when the Tudor house emerged, the middle hall had become a defining characteristic of the English house. The Tudor house of the 16th and early 17th centuries developed a set of new features that enhanced the appeal of the exterior and interiors. In houses like Condover Hall, Castleton House, and Eastbury Manor, the organization of the house became centered on the middle hall, including a porch, corridor, screens passage, dais, and balcony, as Andres has already pointed out. The staircase, now more prominent, remained separate from the hall, and the sequence of spaces going through the porch, passage, and hall, originally derived from the 14th century manor house, continued up to the 17th century. On the exterior, a series of features became typical of Tudor architecture, such as the pitched roof, gables, bay windows with integrated mullions, tall chimneys, masonry work surrounding doors and windows, and walls in masonry and exposed brickwork. Some significant stylistic changes that came from Italy indicate Palladio's influence, but the main core of the middle hall endured up to the 18th century. The middle hall, with its double-height interiors, had a grand fireplace, and its walls were decorated with wainscoting and carved friezes. Most of these features were later taken up with the revival of the Tudor style in the second half of the 19th century. It was this style revival that, later in the 20th century, captured the imagination of clients and architects in Bogota.
Good afternoon, Alan. My question is more of an exhibition question or of a museographical question. We've presented in the exhibition principally Voices Broadleys as an example of an arts and crafts house that has a Tudor type of hall in it, or one that at any rate can be compared in plan and possibly to some extent in function to a Tudor hall. Voisey is a very interesting architect because for many reasons, and one of them perhaps principally is the paradox, which is that someone whose houses mostly looked much the same can be interpreted in a very large number of ways. So my question is to you is, to what extent do you think that it is reasonable to show a Voisey house as being an exemplar of the way in which the plan and atmosphere of the medieval hall was revived in late 19th century architecture? It's a completely open question. My own work on Voisey suggests that he took much more directly from Tudor architecture than might have been thought, but that again, I think, is open to interpretation. The second question relates to a house, not Broadleys, but the Lees, the house by Walton, which is not a well-known house, which has at its centre a very large billiard room. It has a double height space, it has a gallery around that space, and it has a billiard table in the centre, which essentially means that unlike other big billiard rooms, which usually in Edwardian houses were put round the side, this one occupies the space which might be compared to a medieval hall. So therefore, my question is, to what extent do you think that the examples we have chosen convey the message about the genealogy of the house that they are intended to convey?
Something much bigger, I think, happens in the change in the early modern period. And I have to say, first of all, I'm not an expert on this, and many of my ideas about it are speculative. But if one takes the notion that in origin, as world vernacular shows us, all houses are sacred places, they all represent an axis mundi. This is where earth and heaven are joined together. And the Mongolian yurt is a notable example of how an apparently simple space and structure is in fact highly symbolically ordered without any physical differentiation, but just everybody knows what's what when they go into one, where they're supposed to be. The same, I think, is true of the medieval hall house. There were very strict codes, as I understand it. And they take the form they do in order to represent these codes about hierarchy, particularly about directionality. You have the high end and the low end. And in the Tudor period, that completely disappears. Life has become more complex. That kind of belief seems not to matter anymore. Chastleton, I find fascinating because it retains this sort of ghost of the hall as it used to be with the screen's passage, but the screen's passage doesn't go where it's meant to go. And there's another house beyond with a different message entirely. So it's kind of relic. It's an evolutionary dead end. It's a duck-billed platypus, call it what you will. And yet, what is evident is that in the way houses are, as it were, the frontier between a private realm and a public realm outside, you have to have the first stage of the negotiation between those two realms. And that's what the hall is. It's where the people from the inside and the people from the outside are going to have to negotiate whatever it is that they've come to do. And the kind of furnishing and presentation of the hall deals with that. You're not really in the house yet. You're still half outside when you enter the hall. And so in terms of what Patricia was talking about, there is a survival of form, but I think the meaning has substantially altered. And that is perhaps the prelude for losing the hall, because it doesn't really mean anything anymore. And once you get into Palladian symmetry, there is still, you have to walk into the house through a main door. You have to have a space you get to, which is not a specific room, but it's a more generic room. But it no longer has the same directional form or any of what goes with that. In relation to what Timothy was saying, I think in the stage of revival, it's very interesting. The hall still has this function of being the intermediary liminal space, if you like. And yes, the Tudor period does set a good example, partly because it's very open in terms of its interpretation. I think it's interesting that Broadleys is a holiday house, and it's built at a time when social conventions are changing, and there's a greater freedom, I think, in terms of who is going to spend time in the same room. Younger, older people, men, women, children, is how I read it. I know nothing about the Briggs family and how they occupied that house, but at least the design is kind of encouraging a more informal interaction, I think. And it is to do with this fact that the Victorians had made all their rooms so specific in terms of who was in them and what they were doing. There are other aspects here which I think are very interesting, particularly about heating, that the English dependence on the open fire meant that the fire, while it had moved from the center of the hall, is still an important symbolic location, the hearth, and actually the place where you can be warm, and how close to that fire you come. The billiard table at the Lees certainly is interesting, and it must tell us something about the people who lived there, that they were willing to sacrifice such a major part of that space to this immovable object. This is the thing, you can't pick up a billiard table and move it to another room. Other things you can move, but at Blackwell, Bailey Scott accommodated the billiard table in the low-ceilinged area at the side of the hall, which makes perfect sense that men who play billiards, essentially, women may play billiards, but it's essentially the men's game. But they are in visual and audible contact with the women who are in the same room, who may be sitting in the ingle nook, doing their needlework, having conversation. I mean, Blackwell, I think, is absolutely fascinating, the sort of dramas and scenarios one can imagine going on in there, the flirtations, the confidences, looking down on somebody and seeing what they're up to. I love that complexity. The Lees doesn't afford that. One thing, it may not be quite the right context for it, but I'm very interested in the idea of halls and their potential for dancing. Now, we don't think about houses in terms of dancing very often, but I think I can summon up enough sort of notions of, there's probably not a very regular activity, but it's quite an important one, that you hold a dance. It's a major part of the courtship ritual, of course, and we know all this from TV costume dramas. So the hall is the place where we're going to do it, because it's big and tall and high, and if it has a gallery, so much the better. The musicians can go there. And I think this may be an overlooked function of the middle hall, to be the room where you have those events involving a lot of people, because the other rooms have too much furniture and not enough clear floor space. The billiard table is in the wrong place as far as that is concerned, but obviously that they're not going to hold a dance there. I think that's all I have to say.